Now it's time to deliver the sermon that you've written. Let's talk about how to do that in a way that your listeners will remember and in a way that invites them to respond to the word that you preach. So let's start with sermon notes. When I was in full-time preaching ministry, I went several years where I preached without notes, and it's very effective. But preaching without notes greatly increases the time and intensity of sermon preparation. And I'm going to go ahead and say, I don't think there's any way that's going to be practical for you. If you have a full-time job outside the church or all these other responsibilities, you're just not going to have the time to devote to go without notes when you preach. In my current role with the CCL, I preach in a lot of different churches, but I do a lot of other stuff too. And I don't have the time to give to any one sermon to go noteless. So I preach from notes. And it's okay. It doesn't make my preaching ineffective, and it won't make your preaching ineffective. So what do you use for notes? Well, if you're a beginning preacher, I would strongly recommend using detailed notes. There's a lot of guys who are new to preaching, but they think, I just need a rough basic outline in the pulpit, and I'll be good. And then they get up there and they ramble and they stumble through their transitions and they forget about that important thing they wanted to say. And it just would have been so much better if they had more detailed notes in the pulpit with them. And that's what I would strongly encourage you to do. That's what I do. I preach from a full manuscript. I use my notes on an iPad. I use a PDF script on an iPad. I use a black background with white letters, and I use red letters for slide transitions. It's just a good contrast. I can see it well. I use 24-point font because my eyesight's not that good anymore. That's what works for me. Choose what works for you. Maybe it's an iPad. Maybe it's a laptop. Maybe it's paper. But whatever you use, I would strongly encourage you to take detailed notes into the pulpit with you. But those notes cannot rob your listeners of eye contact. You've got to visually engage with your listeners. And that means you have to know your sermon well enough that you're not chained to your notes. You don't have to have it memorized, but you need to know it well enough that you can look up from your notes and visually engage with your audience. You may not be able to look squarely at every single person in the room, but if you consciously make eye contact with every part of the room, by the end of your sermon, everyone there is going to feel like you engaged with them on a personal level. Now, when it comes to your sermon delivery, remember, no one wants to listen to a monotone speaker. It's boring, right? Sermon delivery requires a lot of variety. Raise the volume, lower the volume. Pick up the pace, slow it down. Insert a pregnant pause. Do all of that stuff to change it up. If you're into fishing, a lot of the best fishermen will tell you, like if you're retrieving a lure, vary the speed. You know, you're reeling slow, and then you speed it up, and then you slow it down, and then you speed it up. And a lot of times, the change in speed, when you do that, that's when the fish will strike. That's when you'll hook the fish. Same thing in sermon delivery. Keep changing it up. Variety will keep your listeners hooked, and it will help them to hear and respond to the truth that you're preaching. So how do you do all of this? How do you learn to do it? Apologies to Allen Iverson, but we're going to talk about practice. You practice your sermon. And by practice, I mean you take your actual sermon notes and you preach the entire sermon out loud. And that might feel awkward at first. I mean, I'm talking out loud and there's no one here. I get, like, if you're thinking, how can that not be weird? It will feel weird. It will feel awkward at first, but it's really important to push through that because there's a lot of things that are going to happen when you practice your sermon. Preferably, you practice in the same room where you're going to preach. If you can do that, it'll help you get a feel for the room. That's really helpful. But as you practice it out loud, the rough spots in your sermon, you're going to find them. You know, like I need to figure out how to make that transition work better. You're going to find stuff like I should really add something here, or this really just needs to go. It's not adding anything to the sermon. I need to delete it. You're going to find all of that when you practice. Practice will also help you time your sermon. I use it's called Present Timer. It's an app on my phone. I'm actually using it to keep track of my time on this video right now. And what this app does, it's a stopwatch, and I have it set so one bell will ring at 20 minutes, another bell will ring at 25 minutes, and three bells will ring at 30 minutes. So it's one bell, two bells, three bells. If I hear three bells at 30 minutes, that means I better be wrapping this sermon up or it's going to be too long. Practice will help you time that out. There's just a lot of good things that happen when you practice your sermon. And then, after Sunday, go back and watch your sermon. It's really important to record your sermon, to get a video of it. Even if your church doesn't stream or do anything online, if all you can do is set up a phone to just record your sermon, do that. Whatever you have to do, record a video of your sermon and then go back and watch it that next week. I watch every sermon I preach, and let me tell you, it still makes me squirm. I've been preaching since I was a teenager. It still makes me squirm when I watch myself preach, because I will always think, man, I could have said that in a different way, or man, why didn't they laugh? I thought that was funny. All these things. It's an uncomfortable discipline, but make yourself watch all the sermons you preach, because as you do, it's going to make you a better preacher, because as you watch, you'll be able to ask questions like, okay, how was my pace? A lot of preachers, especially new preachers, will talk too fast and like, all right, how was my pace? Do I need to slow it down? Did I make good eye contact with all parts of the room? Did my illustrations land? Did the one big idea of my sermon really come through in the end? All of this stuff is going to be there on the video. And if you'll commit to watching all of your sermons, watch it that next week, you will grow in your sermon delivery. But in the end, give yourself grace, because your sermon's not going to be perfect. Again, I've been preaching since I was a teenager. I have yet to preach the perfect sermon, and I never will. Your sermon is not going to be perfect. Doesn't mean we can't grow. We all want to grow. We all want to get better. That's why you're watching these videos. That's what this is all about. But give yourself grace when your sermon's not perfect. As long as you point to the one who is perfect, as long as you point to the one whose grace perfectly covers over all of our sin through his death and resurrection, as long as you do that, you're good. You're going to grow. You're going to get better as a preacher. It's never going to be perfect, but that's okay. So get after it. Go take your sermon notes, practice, record the practice, go back and watch that. And then you'll be ready, deliver that message on Sunday, go back and watch it, and just give yourself grace as God grows you as a communicator of his word.